My name is Lysandra Vale. I am 34 years old. Until this morning, I thought I understood what family really meant. I live in a small apartment on the second floor of an old building in Baltimore. You have to walk up narrow stairs to get to my place. I have lived in this building for many years. I also take care of it. I fix things when they break. I talk to the people who live here. This is the same building my grandmother loved very much. She spent almost her whole life taking care of it. In the winter, the old radiator makes loud knocking and singing sounds. Sometimes it wakes people up at night. The stairs make squeaky noises when you walk on them. Some steps feel loose, but everyone knows how to step carefully. Even with all its problems, this building feels warm and safe. It is my home. It is also the home of many other people who live here. This morning, my sister walked into my apartment without knocking. She did not say hello. She did not smile kindly. She just walked in like she owned the place. She put a folded paper on my kitchen table and stepped back. I picked it up and opened it. On the paper, written very neatly, was a big number. The number was $8,100. I stared at it for a long time. My heart started beating fast. That number was my new rent. My rent was going up from $2,350 to more than 4 times that amount. The paper said this change was happening because the market can handle it. My sister did not explain anything. She just stood there and smiled. Her smile was sharp and cold. I could tell she liked seeing my face when I read the number. She enjoyed my shock. About an hour later, my phone rang. It was my parents. They wanted to explain why this change was fair. They talked for a long time. They used big words like opportunity, appreciation, and investment. They said the building was worth more money now. They said changes like this were normal. But they never talked about the people who lived here. They never talked about how no normal person in this building could ever pay that much rent and still buy food or medicine or clothes. They said my lower rent before was a favor. They said favors do not last forever. They spoke calmly, like they were teaching a lesson. What they did not know was that my fingers still had ink on them from signing very different papers. For the last 4 years, without my sister or my parents knowing, I had been more than just the woman who fixed sinks and mailboxes. Because of my grandmother, I was holding a secret that could change everything. A secret that could turn this business decision upside down. A secret that could turn my sister's proud moment into the start of something very bad for her. But before I continue, hit the subscribe button and tell me where are you watching this from, and what time of day is it. By late afternoon, the day felt very heavy on my body and my mind. My chest felt tight. My thoughts felt slow. I picked up my phone and called someone who had known me my whole life. I hoped they would help me understand things better. But the moment I heard my mother's voice, I knew the truth. She sounded calm and confident. Her voice was smooth, like she had practiced her words many times. She told me that changes were needed. She said this was just how life works. She said I should let my sister handle things the way successful people do. She spoke like there was no other choice. Then my father joined the call. His voice was steady and flat. He sounded distant. He agreed with my mother. He said the decision was good for the future. It felt like the choice had been made long before I ever knew about it. They were not angry. They did not yell. But there was something colder than anger in their voices. They talked about growth and success. They talked like everything was simple. It was clear what they thought. I was the problem. I was standing in the way. I ended the call. My hands were shaking. My chest felt empty. I opened my apartment door and stepped into the hallway. The hallway was filled with quiet movement. The doors opened slowly. People whispered to each other. Footsteps moved back and forth on the old wooden floor. News spreads fast in a building like this. Especially bad news. Mrs. Safira stood near the stairwell. She held an envelope in both hands. Her fingers were shaking. She had lived in this building almost her whole adult life. Long before I ever became the manager. The fear in her eyes hurt me deeply. Across the hall, Mr. Torin leaned on his walker. He was breathing hard. He kept whispering numbers to himself, like he was trying to solve a math problem that had no answer. Farther down the hallway, the Kim family was packing toys into a cardboard box. Small toys. Stuffed animals. A plastic car. Their young daughter kept asking questions. Her parents did not know what to say. There was no yelling. No fighting. Just quiet fear. People did not look at me much. Not because they blamed me, but because hope felt fragile. Like it might break if they touched it. They did not ask who made the decision. They did not ask why. They only asked one thing. Did they still have time to stay? I tried to speak calmly. I tried to sound strong. But my words felt weak in my throat. I had felt powerless before in my life. But this was different. I felt the weight of everyone's lives pressing on me. I was not just losing my home. They were losing everything they knew. And somehow, I felt closer to them than to my own family. After a while, the hallway became quiet again. Then I heard a soft knock on my door. When I opened it, Isolde Vera was standing there. She stood straight and calm. Her face was serious but kind. She did not waste time with hugs or sorry words. She walked inside, folded her scarf carefully, and looked at me closely. She looked like someone who had seen many things in her life. Isolde had known my grandmother very well, better than most of my relatives, and I could tell she had come for a reason. She sat down and spoke clearly. She talked about years ago, about family dinners where people exchanged sharp looks, about money problems my grandmother tried to keep quiet. She said my grandmother had worried about my sister. She thought my sister's strong drive for success was turning cold, turning into something that did not care about people. Then Isolde said something that made the room feel smaller. She said my grandmother did not like keeping important papers in obvious places. She hid things. She hid them where only someone who truly paid attention would look. Isolde did not know exactly what was hidden, but she believed it was meant for me. Not for my parents. Not for my sister. She spoke calmly, like she was pointing to a door I had walked past many times without seeing. She believed my grandmother knew a fight like this would happen one day. And she believed my grandmother prepared for it. When Isolde stood up to leave, I felt different. I was not confident yet, but I had a direction. She touched my arm gently and left. She did not promise anything. She only said she was sure my grandmother left something for me. The hallway was quiet again, but the building felt alive, like it was pushing me forward. The next morning came with clear light and quiet air. I did not hesitate. I picked up a ring of old keys my grandmother had given me years ago. I had never asked why she gave them to me. I went downstairs to the basement. The metal door was stuck. I pushed my shoulder against it until it opened. Inside, it smelled like dust and old paint. The basement looked the same as always. Old boxes. Tangled cords. The low hum of the boiler. But this time it felt different. Like the room knew my story. I walked slowly. I remembered helping Grandma Eudora down here. She always said the basement was the heart of the building. Messy. Forgotten. But holding everything together. I touched the shelves. I followed my memories. Then my hand found her old sewing cabinet. Small. Worn. Broken drawers. I pushed it aside. Under it, I saw a thin crack in the floor. And I knew I was finally close. The marks on the floor looked too straight and too careful to be just normal walking. They didn't look like someone had stumbled or moved quickly. They looked planned. I knelt down on the floor and slid my fingers under a loose wooden board. It felt slightly stuck at first, but then it popped up easily, revealing a small hidden box underneath. The box was made of a material that could survive rain and time, a kind of metal that would not rust easily. It was small enough that someone might not notice it, but heavy enough that it felt very important in my hands. My heart jumped hard once, like a drum hitting suddenly, and then it started beating slowly and steadily, almost as if it was telling me, "Yes, go ahead. Open it." I took a deep breath and lifted the lid. Inside were folders tied with rubber bands, a pile of envelopes sealed carefully, and a small metal tin. The tin rattled softly when I touched it, and I felt a strange curiosity mixed with nervousness. I opened the metal tin first. Inside were keys and a note. The note was written in my grandmother's handwriting. Her handwriting was neat and calm, steady even in her final months. It was the kind of handwriting that made you feel safe and sure, like every letter was carefully thought out. The note simply said, "For when the time comes." That short, simple message made my throat tighten. I felt a strange mixture of comfort and fear. She had known something very important long before I did, something I wasn't ready for until now. I opened the first folder. The papers inside were not old photographs or little memories I could look at and smile. They were serious papers, carefully arranged like they had been planned for a very long time. At the top of the first page was a stamp and a notarized seal, which meant it was official and legal. It was an agreement for a company called Vale Heritage LLC. I read the page slowly, feeling my stomach tighten. My name was written clearly as the sole owner of the company. Beneath it were two signatures, mine and my grandmother's. Suddenly, I remembered helping her with paperwork once, thinking I was just being helpful with small tasks. I had no idea she had been quietly giving me ownership of an entire building, a gift and responsibility she had planned without me realizing it. I set the first folder down carefully and picked up the next one. Inside were printed emails, conversations between Zephyra and a man named Evander Klein. He worked for a company that bought and redeveloped buildings. The emails sounded polite and professional, but when I read them carefully, I could tell they were about planning how to take advantage of the building. They talked about money, empty apartments, and ways to speed up getting people to leave. Reading the emails made my stomach twist. They treated people not as humans, but as numbers or problems to be solved. The emails felt urgent, like they were trying to rush something that should have been done carefully. I forced myself to keep reading, even though my heart felt heavy. One envelope caught my eye. It was a handwritten letter addressed to me. The ink had faded and the edges were slightly curled, but my grandmother's voice came through every word. She wrote that she had been worried about the people she trusted. She feared that some people would not care for the building the way she had. She wrote that some might let greed or ambition cloud their judgment, forgetting kindness and fairness. Then she said something that made my chest feel both heavy and warm. She trusted me because I always saw people as individuals, not as numbers. That mattered more than anyone else might understand. She explained quietly why she made the decisions she did, without drama or anger. She wanted to protect the building and the people who lived there. Her faith in me pressed against my chest. It was comforting, but also terrifying. I had never asked for any of this responsibility, yet she had entrusted it all to me. I closed the letter and sat back on the cool concrete floor. My head felt full and my hands trembled slightly. Nothing in my life felt simple anymore. But beneath the fear and weight, I felt something else, a steady, sharp feeling. Purpose. I gathered all the documents into a neat stack and locked them inside my bag. There was still one more step I couldn't ignore. My grandmother had trusted a single lawyer with her estate. His name came to my mind clearly, like she had whispered it into the room herself, Cashin Orlin. If anyone could explain what my grandmother had done, it would be him. I climbed the stairs with the box carefully secured in my bag, my fingers brushing the worn railing my grandmother once held. Every step made me feel more like I was entering a new part of my life. For the first time in days, I felt that the path ahead was not a scary collapse, but a revelation I had to understand. By the afternoon, I drove across town toward a small brick building tucked between a bakery and a travel agency. I had never visited it before, but I recognized it immediately from the name on the glass door, Law Office of Cashin Orlin. My grandmother trusted very few people with details she considered important, and Cashin had been one of them. The weight of the documents in my bag made me feel even more certain that I needed someone like him to explain everything. Inside the office, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and citrus cleaner. It was orderly, calm, and precise, just like my grandmother's handwriting. A receptionist motioned for me to wait, and within minutes, I was ushered into a narrow room lined with framed case summaries and awards. At a wooden desk sat Cashin Orlin. He looked to be in his late 60s, with silver hair neatly combed back and a calm expression that seemed to say he had expected me long before I realized I needed to come. I handed him the folders without saying a word. I watched his face as he looked through the papers. His expression shifted from recognition to concentration. He read quickly, turning each page with the assured rhythm of someone who knew exactly what to look for. My grandmother had prepared him. That was clear. He paused when he reached the letter addressed to me. He let out a long breath that seemed equal parts sadness and admiration. Then he organized the papers into neat stacks, aligning the corners carefully before speaking. His explanation was calm and steady, filled with legal words that sounded complicated to me, but clearly made perfect sense to him. He told me that my grandmother had planned everything carefully. She had transferred ownership years earlier. Vale Heritage LLC operated separately from the family trusts that my parents and Zephyra believed controlled the building. The agreement I had signed gave me full authority, without anyone else noticing. Zephyra had influence only because she thought the old trust still controlled the property, but legally, she had no right to make changes without my approval. The rent increase she pushed forward had no real legal power. Hearing him explain it made my pulse slow. Finally, someone outside the family was confirming what my grandmother had done. Cashin then explained the financial records. They showed recurring maintenance withdrawals under companies tied to redevelopment firms. Money had been taken for years, long before Zephyra tried to raise the rent. My grandmother must have kept those records to protect the building and the tenants. Cashin folded his hands and said the next decisions would be mine. I would decide the building's future, as well as how the family thought about control. He explained carefully how to safeguard the records, document interactions with Zephyra, and be prepared for her attempts to push residents. His advice was practical and steady, shaped by years of helping people with property and community issues. I realized my grandmother had chosen him not just for his legal expertise, but because he was calm, careful, and fair. He reached into his cabinet and gave me a binder labeled with my name. Inside was a timeline my grandmother had drafted. It outlined the steps she hoped I would take if the need ever arose. It was not a strict rulebook, but a guide to help me see what she trusted me to do. I realized she had believed in me before I believed in myself. She had also explained why she never confronted Zephyra directly. She knew that letting consequences happen naturally would be stronger than arguing. Leaving the office, the sunlight felt sharp on my skin. The binder rested in my hands like a quiet promise. The building was not just a place where people lived. It was a responsibility, and now it was mine. By the end of the week, the tension in the building felt ready to snap. Hallways were quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath. Something was coming, but nobody could say exactly what. That feeling became real early one morning when loud footsteps echoed in the stairwell. A clipboard hit the metal railing with a hollow sound. I stepped out of my apartment and saw my sister Zephyra leading 3 men in stiff suits. They each held clipboards with printed lists. Zephyra walked ahead like she owned the place, her heels clicking loudly, marking her steps like a metronome. She didn't look at me or any of the residents. Instead, she pointed toward apartments as if she had full authority. Her face was bold and serious, but it felt forced, like she was putting on a show for someone. The men in suits followed her, scanning the hallways with detached interest. Their stiffness made the residents uneasy. It was clear that Zephyra wanted to appear powerful, even if she had no real right to do so. She handed one of the men a folder and gestured toward the lower-floor apartments. She instructed him to start documenting everything he saw. It didn't matter that she had no real authority. What mattered to her was the performance. But what Zephyra didn't know was that the building had already begun to change. The night before, residents had met together. A woman named Talia Rune, a housing counselor from a local nonprofit, explained their rights calmly. She told them how to record everything, be transparent, and stand together. Now doors opened one by one. Residents gathered in small groups, arms folded, phones ready to record. They were not angry, just firm. The men in suits hesitated, unsure what to do. One of them glanced at Zephyra for direction. Her jaw tightened, but she pressed forward, insisting. They continue. The first inspection began at Mrs. Safira's apartment. Everyone was watching, but they were ready. No one could intimidate them easily. The residents stood together, quiet but determined. Zephyra thought she had control, but the building was teaching her a lesson she could not ignore. The morning felt tense, like the calm before a storm. But it was a different kind of storm. It was the power of a community standing together, guided by the wisdom my grandmother had left behind. And everything was about to change. She stood near the doorway with Talia by her side, giving quiet support. Talia held her hand just lightly, the way friends do when they know someone is nervous. The men went into the apartments, checking everything. They looked at the pipes to see if water was leaking. They looked at the wires to make sure electricity was safe. They even looked at walls, ceilings, and floors to see if anything was broken. But there was nothing wrong anywhere. Everything was clean, neat, and safe. The apartments had been taken care of for years, and it showed. Zephyra hovered behind the men, her hands folded, her face tight with tension. She wanted to find a reason to complain, to make the families look careless, but nothing was wrong. The building was perfect. Zephyra's face tightened as she realized she might not find anything. She tried harder, looking for little mistakes that weren't there. But the apartments were orderly, well-kept, and ready for anyone to see. When nothing went wrong, Zephyra's irritation grew. She bit her lip and shifted her weight from one foot to another. The next apartment was the Kim family's. They had lived there for a long time, and everything was just as it should be. Their rooms were clean, their furniture neat, and the walls and floors looked cared for. The same thing happened again. The men asked fewer questions. Their voices sounded unsure, quiet, as if they didn't want to make mistakes. They finished taking notes and moved down the hallway, where other residents watched. The residents didn't cheer, didn't clap. They just stood silently, showing their strength quietly. Zephyra's confidence was shrinking. She had thought she could scare everyone, but her plan wasn't working. The more the inspectors walked through, the thinner her confidence became. By the time they reached the last apartment, the inspections were over. The men seemed eager to leave, whispering quietly to each other. One said something to Zephyra, but she waved it off, pretending it didn't matter. Her face hardened, like a cold shell around her emotions. She looked around the building at the calm, steady residents, and for the first time, she seemed shaken. Then, without warning, she announced that the family would meet at Uncle Galen's office the next day to discuss problems in the building. She spoke sharply, holding on to whatever authority she thought she still had. There was no explanation and no invitation for discussion. It was just an order. The residents didn't respond out loud, but they had already seen her plan fail. As the inspection team left, the residents quietly returned to their apartments, feeling relief spread through the halls. The hallway became calm again. But under that calm there was a new feeling, confidence. They all knew Zephyr's attempt to scare them had failed. I closed my door behind me and put the binder from Cashin on my desk. The inspections hadn't shown anything about the building itself, but they had shown everything about my sister trying to control it. I knew that tomorrow's meeting wouldn't be about the building. It would be about the truth coming out, and Zephyr didn't know she had already lost. The next morning felt heavy from the moment I stepped outside. The clouds hung low over the city, covering the sky and muting the morning sunlight. I drove carefully through the busy streets to Uncle Galen's office. The building was in a small business area with narrow streets and many little offices. It was the kind of place where papers and documents mattered more than people's personalities. It seemed like the perfect setting for what was about to happen. I parked my car, took a deep breath, and walked to the glass doors. The binder from Cashin was tucked tightly under my arm. When I entered, the office was warm and lit by soft yellow lights. My sister was already there, sitting straight in a navy blue blazer. Her face looked sharp and smart, a mix of pride and calculation. My parents stood near the windows, talking quietly until I came in. They stopped their whispers and looked at me, a strange mix of expectation and impatience on their faces, like they thought the outcome had already been decided before I even walked in. Zephyr didn't hide her confidence. She looked at me as if I was a problem she had already solved. Uncle Galen greeted us politely with careful words and led everyone to a large conference room. A long oak table stretched across the room. Folders were neatly placed at each seat, and a framed picture of water sat in the center. The room looked ready for a big meeting, as if it had been waiting for this confrontation for a long time. I sat across from Zephyr and put the binder on the table without opening it. She followed the movement with a narrow, watchful glance. The meeting began with Uncle Galen talking about changes to the building. He spoke about redevelopment plans, making the property more valuable, and the benefits of working with investors. His tone was calm and steady, but every word he said sounded suspiciously like the plans Zephyr had been promoting. Then Zephyr took over. She framed the building as valuable but not performing well. She showed glossy pictures and numbers, timelines for renovations and estimated returns. She explained buyouts and investment plans. She spoke clearly and confidently. My parents nodded along, seemingly persuaded by the promise of more money. They said family unity depended on following Zephyr's direction. But it felt hollow, like they were just saying words out of habit rather than belief. I watched their faces carefully. My mother's smile was a little forced. My father's jaw was tight. I felt the usual distance settle between us. Their vision of family was built on hierarchy, and Zephyr sat at the top. In that hierarchy, she was in charge. When they finished talking, the room became quiet, waiting for my approval. For a moment, their expectation felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on the table. Then I opened the binder. The first set of papers slid across the table with a soft rustle. I explained calmly that Vale Heritage LLC owned the building completely. The top agreement had my grandmother's signature and mine. My signature was right beside hers, proving I was the sole owner. Zephyr's confidence faltered. She stared at the papers as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. My parents exchanged uneasy glances, confusion replacing certainty. Next, I placed the financial records in front of them. The ledgers detailed withdrawals from building funds to companies tied directly to Zephyr. The amounts were clear, showing she had taken money that wasn't hers. I spoke calmly as I showed the implications, letting the papers tell the story. The binder had everything. Maintenance charges that never reached the contractors, consulting fees routed to fake companies, and monthly transfers with no legitimate purpose. Finally, I set down the last file. It contained printed emails between Zephyr and Evander Klein. Their conversations outlined strategies to empty the building, accelerate vacancies, and make the property ready for redevelopment. The language was careful but clear. Each email revealed more of her plan than the last. Zephyr's face drained of color as the pages spread out on the table. Silence filled the room. My parents looked shocked, unsure what to think. Zephyra tried to speak, but her words collapsed before they came out. Her composure had cracked. Panic replaced confidence. Then there was a knock on the door. Cashin Orlin entered, calm and measured. Behind him stood an investigator from the city attorney's office, carrying a thin folder. The investigator introduced himself professionally, saying he needed to discuss financial discrepancies related to the property. His tone wasn't harsh, but it carried authority. Zephyr's reaction was immediate. Her face showed disbelief and growing dread. She looked at each of us, searching for a way out that didn't exist. My parents stood frozen. Their earlier confidence vanished under the weight of the truth. The investigator waited patiently, holding the door open for Zephyra. By the time she spoke, the room no longer belonged to her. Weeks passed, and the full weight of Zephyra's actions finally reached the courtroom downtown. The building felt cold, despite the sun shining through the tall windows. The air carried a stillness, like the spaces themselves knew that decisions were about to reshape lives. I took a seat behind the rail, the binder resting on my lap. I didn't need it anymore. Every document, every number, and every quiet realization had already settled into my memory. This was no longer about surprise. It was about truth stepping forward, impossible to ignore. When the hearing began, the charges were read with calm precision. They outlined patterns of financial misconduct tied directly to Zephyra. They described withdrawals disguised as maintenance fees, transfers to fake companies she controlled, and efforts to pressure residents to leave. The prosecutor presented each piece of evidence with certainty, leaving little room for argument. I watched my sister at the defense table. She sat stiffly, eyes forward. She looked smaller than I remembered, as if the confidence she once wore had melted away under the bright courtroom lights. Witnesses were called. Mrs. Safira spoke about sudden notices and fear that spread through the hallways. The Kim family described the confusion and stress their daughter felt when told she might need to leave her school. Mr. Torin, leaning on his walker, recounted the sudden pressure placed on older tenants. Their voices carried exhaustion, not anger. They showed how stability could be threatened when someone treats other people as disposable. I was called last. The judge asked direct questions about my role, the documents, and my grandmother's plans. I answered steadily, aware that her foresight had become a shield. Speaking her name aloud gave me courage, as if I was holding her hand across time. The courtroom listened, not with sympathy, but with attention to the facts that tied everything together. When arguments concluded, the judge gave the decision. Zephyra was found guilty of financial misconduct and sentenced to state custody. The judge emphasized how her actions harmed tenants and how deliberate her plans had been. There was no outburst, no dramatic plea. Zephyra's face simply collapsed, recognizing that the path she chose ended where it always would. My parents approached me briefly afterward. Their faces carried worry, disbelief, and a touch of regret, but it didn't reach deep. They asked if I wanted to talk. I told them no. There were no arguments, no raised voices. A quiet distance built over years of choices remained. They stepped back, and I walked past them without looking back. Outside, the air felt lighter than it had in months. The city was alive with noise, cars, people talking, trains rumbling in the distance. Life went on as if nothing monumental had happened. Yet everything in my world had shifted. I headed toward the building, the one my grandmother had protected through careful planning and quiet courage. Standing on the sidewalk, I watched the windows shine in the late afternoon light. Each window held stories of people who had endured uncertainty together. In the weeks that followed, I worked with Talia Rune to stabilize rents, arrange repairs the building truly needed, and offer long-term agreements to residents who feared losing their homes. Their relief wasn't loud. It came in small ways. Doors held open, warm greetings shared, calm returning floor by floor. I felt it every time I walked the stairwell. The creak of the steps no longer reminded me of pressure. It reminded me of continuity, of life going steadily forward. Late one evening, I stood at the entrance and let the quiet settle around me. The building wasn't perfect, it never had been, but it was honest and it was ours. My grandmother's legacy wasn't the bricks or the walls. It was the clarity to step away from people who confuse control with care. It was the courage to protect what mattered, even when standing alone. If there was a lesson in all of this, it was simple. Families aren't only defined by blood. They are defined by the choices they make when honesty and integrity are tested. Sometimes the healthiest act of loyalty is refusing to follow someone down a path that hurts everyone around them. And sometimes doing what is right is far stronger than doing what seems easy.